Hello and welcome to Tech Talk Thursday. I'm your host, Ray Marquina, and today we are continuing on to part 3 of our 3-part series using Delta Lake as our control table for full and incremental refreshes. And if you haven't seen part 1 or part 2, do me a favor, go back and check out those videos first. Those videos are going to give a better sense of where we are in the series. Also, if you're enjoying the series, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe. We produce similar content and do our best to upload twice a month. With that out of the way, in part 2, we left off building our initial pipeline and ended with loading our port and vessel tables, as you see in front of you. In this video, we're going to do a number of things. First, we're going to use Expression Builder in our pipelines to drive which select statement we want to run, whether the full or the incremental select statement. We will modify our file name to differentiate between full and incremental loads. And lastly, we will build a notebook to perform an update to the isInitialLoad flag and watermark after the data has been loaded. So with that, let's jump right back into our pipeline. And from our pipeline, we are going to navigate to the for each activity, click the pencil icon, go into our copy data activity under the source tab. This is where we're going to start making our first modifications. So under the use query property, we're now going to select the query radio button, and that's going to pop up a text box where we can now add dynamic content. So I'm going to click on this blue link here. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to need to recognize that there are a couple of variables that we're going to want to persist out into the expression builder that will allow us to make the decision of what condition our select statement is going to fall under. So what I typically like to do in this particular case is I like to bring up SSMS, write my queries, write a little bit of pseudocode so that we can understand what we want to put in this expression builder. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'll pull over SSMS and we can start writing a little bit of pseudocode to try and give us a good basis or a good foundation so that we can understand really what we're trying to let the expression builder do. So I'm going to say if our initial load flag is true, then I want to run a unfiltered select statement. And I will use DBO port as my guinea pig here. So all I'm going to want to do is run a select all from. This will be, again, if the initial load flag is true, meaning I need to do an initial load of this data and I need to pull everything, then have no filters here present. Else, what we're going to want to do now is add our where clause. So I can say where, and remember we have created time and modified time. Created time is going to be specifically for those newly inserted records from the time that we did our last initial load. And then the modified time is going to be anything that might have gotten updated between the first pull and the second pull. So we can say where our modified date time is greater than or equal to our watermark. And that should really be it. Again, if you can follow through the series of steps that are going to happen is the very first time this pipeline runs, it will look at the control table and our values will be set to an isInitialLoad as true, and the watermark date times will be null. So when we run this for the first time, it's important that we update our control table to change this flag, the isInitialLoad flag to false, and populate a watermark so that we know what time we want to pull data for the next run. And then once this becomes false, we will no longer run this expression. We will run the second expression, and this is where we will use the watermark times against our create time and modify time. And I hope that that's clear. So the next thing to do here is to navigate back to our expression builder and write this out in Synapse. So I find it easiest to go into our functions. Here you can find all types of functions. Specifically, we're looking at logical functions. So we're going to use the if condition. We're going to use the equals condition. And let me see if I can find equals. So equals, within equals, it takes two values. It's going to take the expression, and then it's going to take what you wish that expression to evaluate to. So here we're going to want to use the isInitialLoad flag. So we'll say initial load, and then it's separated by comma, and we want it to be equal to 1. Now, because this is a flag and not an integer value, I will cast it to a Boolean. And that should be how we handle that expression. So if my initial load flag equals true, comma, then run our select statement. So in order for us to add that select statement, I will use some single quotes and say select all from. So I will need to now concatenate my schema as well as my table. So I'm going to throw this around a concat function. This is also separated by a comma. And I will say that I want to now bring in my schema name. And then I also want to separate it with a period and then bring in my table name. And I will close out the concat function, and then I will also add just a single quote to make sure my syntax is still correct, and there we have it. So this is going to be the first, so this is what the evaluation, this is what the expression will evaluate to if it is true. Now, what we need to do is we need to add our else condition. So I'm just going to copy this here. If you recall, all we're doing is really just adding a where condition here. So again, I'm going to add a concatenation here, and I'm going to say where create time is greater than or equal to, and here's now where I can pull in my watermark. I'll separate it with a space. Watermark date time. And then I can start the next expression here and say or modified time is greater than or equal to, once again, my watermark time. And I would need to add some commas here to continue on that concatenation. And then lastly, I need to close out the concats. And that should be what our expression looks like. Now, there's a little bit of typecasting that needs to happen here in order for us to have compatible data types. So if you recall, the watermark date time was a timestamp, and the create time in our SQL Server is going to be a date time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast these as date time 2 to have some compatibility here. So I will cast this as date time 2. I will do the same for the modified. Cast as date time 2. And close that off. Now, the other thing that we need to also modify is the quotes. So when we're writing this in SQL, it's important that those dates that we are evaluating against are encapsulated in single quotes. And in order for us to do that, we need to put in 4 quotes around each of the dates. So we'll start with the first watermark, 4, the comma, and then close off those quotes as well. And then we will do it once again for the last watermark. And close it off with the concat 3, 4. All right, and that is going to be our expression that we will use. Once again, we are basically saying that if our initial load is equal to true, we're going to run this condition, else we're going to run this condition with the where clause. I'm going to click OK. Now, I've already made the appropriate changes to the sync. What I said initially in the video was I wanted to make sure that we changed the file name. This is going to use very similar logic to what we just wrote. Basically, if the initial load flag is true, we're just going to do table.parquet file. Else, what I've done is I've added a concat function to do an underscore, give me the trigger time of the pipeline, .parquet. This way I could differentiate between full loads and incremental loads. My incrementals having a timestamp associated to the Parquet file. I'm going to click OK. All right. The next thing that we're going to want to do is create a notebook. And to create our notebook, I'm going to navigate over to the Develop tab, click the plus icon, and click Notebook. Let's go ahead and give this notebook a name. I'll call it NB Update Control Table. Click OK. First thing that we're going to want to do is attach it to a Spark pool. So I have one provision called Demo Pool that we'll use. And the language that I'm going to use in this example is going to be PySpark. I'm going to use PySpark because I find it easier to pass in variables or parameters in this way. So you can certainly use Spark SQL if you wish. That might be a little bit more challenging to add those parameters if you want it passed into your notebook. So let's go ahead and start writing our code. So this is going to be very similar to Dynamic SQL. If you worked with Dynamic SQL before in SQL Server, I'm going to go ahead and write our variable called SQL, and then I'm going to go ahead and write our update statement. So I'm going to update control table demo, and we're going to set our, let's set our is initial load flag equal to false, and then we're going to want to set our watermark date time to the value that we're going to pass in from the parameter that we're going to pass in through our notebook. So I'm going to say equals, I'm going to give it a plus sign, and I am going to add in the same name. I'm going to call my parameter the same name as the watermark. So let me go ahead and do that. So I need to encase it in single quotes, add the plus, and then do the same here. While also adding a where clause, because remember this is in our for each activity, so this needs to run record by record. So I'm going to say where table is equal to the table that we are processing during our for each activity. So let me say table. And this will be again used the same way. All right. And then the only thing that's left is going to be to execute this command. We can call spark.sql to do that, and then put it in parentheses. And that should be all we need to run our update statement against this notebook. So let me just take a look at the syntax, make sure we look correct. We're going to update our control table demo. We're going to set our isInitialLoad equal to false. After we run initially, right now it's set to true. We're going to set our watermark date time equal to the parameter that we're going to pass our notebook. And it's going to be where the table name equals the table that we're also going to pass in, so we don't update the entire record set. We only update row by row. So this looks correct to me. I'm going to go ahead and commit. And one thing to also note that in order for you to call the notebook through your Synapse pipeline, you have to publish the notebook. So I'm going to go ahead and publish. It's one thing that took me a little bit to figure out. Sure, you can run this in the UI and get a result set back. However, if you do want to call it using your notebook, you do need to publish it. So while that's publishing, I'm going to navigate back to my pipeline. And within our for each activity, I am now going to go under the Synapse category, bring over the notebook activity, and then say on completion, this is when we want to run our notebook. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it update control table. We're going to configure some settings. So the notebook that we're going to want to use is update control table, the one we just set. And this is where we're going to set our base parameters. If you recall, we set up two. One was the watermark, and this is case sensitive, so please make sure that you are using the proper casing. And we're going to use table, which is going to be the type of string. So the value that we're going to want to pass in for our watermark date time is going to be a system variable. And we have one called pipeline trigger time. So this is going to be the date and time that we execute the trigger. I think that's going to be perfect for what we need. And then the other one is going to be the table, which can come from our lookup activity .table. Let's go ahead and run. And now what I want to do is reorient ourselves to see where we are with our control table, where we are with our data, and see and hopefully predict what's going to happen after we run the pipeline. So if I take a look at our control table, we're going to see a couple things. When this data set gets retrieved, you're going to see that the initial load flag is set to true and our watermark date time is set to null. So after our notebook is running through the update, what should happen is that this watermark time will get the system time of the pipeline run. So this will no longer be null. It'll have a timestamp, and our initial load will be set to false. Additionally, in our data lake, I might have some data here now. I'm going to go ahead and delete it. We should have two new files here with the full load Parquet files added back into this raw folder. I'm just deleting them. They were there from last time. So that'll be the two things, or those will be the two things that we look for after the pipeline runs. So I'm going to go back to the pipeline and hit debug. And this shouldn't take too long. I think the longest thing that takes is the notebook piece, because it's provisioning that cluster every time that it warms up. However, we should see the files come in relatively quick. So you can see that we're processing. We've already processed two files. And if I take a look at the inputs, right, this is going to be the evaluation from our expression. You can see that because the isInitialLoad flag was set to true, we don't have a where clause on our select statement. We just have the select all from, which is a good sign that this is working as expected. Now we're at the update control table notebook piece of it. So this takes a while. I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to come back to show you the results. We're back. You can see that the pipeline has finished running. We're now going to go back to raw and do a refresh so that we can see that our files have landed into our data lake, into our freight folder from our raw container. And then, as I mentioned, the other thing that we wanted to see was we wanted to see that our Delta table gets updated appropriately through those notebooks. So now if I run a select all from, you can see that we certainly do have a watermark timestamp uploaded, as well as the isInitialLoad flag has now been set to false. So while the pipeline was running, I did notice that there was a mistake that I had in in the syntax for the copy activity. So just to point that out, if you go to the copy data activity and go back to source and go to the query, a couple things that were incorrect was this date time had a space in it. There should be no space between date time 2. So I corrected it. And also we need spaces after where and after or to ensure that we have the correct syntax. It would treat it as if it was a continuing long statement. So we want to make sure that we have spaces where appropriate. So those are the three changes I made: space to where, space to or, and then date time 2 brought in together. So I just wanted to call that out for those of you following along and trying to get the syntax correct. But there you have it. You can see that our pipeline has finished correctly, and we have now successfully loaded data initially into our data lake. So the next thing that we're now going to want to do is test out the incremental piece. So for that, I'm going to go back to SSMS, and I'm going to add a record into port and vessel. And just so that we can reorient ourselves with what the data looks like, you can see that for port, we have up to port ID 6, and for vessel, we have up until 19. So I'll be adding a 7th row and a 20th row to act as our incremental data. So again, if I select that, now we can see we have a new record with a timestamp of today. And again, that should work within the where clause that we have, because we're looking for a condition where the time that a record was inserted is greater than the startup time of our initial pipeline run. So you saw I ran the pipeline earlier. Now we're later when inserting this record. So this should be able to retrieve these records when I run the pipeline again. So let's go ahead and run the pipeline once more. And let's see if we can get some data landed into our data lake. So you can see we're starting to load data into ADLS. We're starting those copy activities. And again, once we get to read the input, we can really see what our query is doing. So you can see that this is successful now. And this is exactly what we wanted to see. We wanted to see that the if condition evaluated to the second select statement that we had. And if I take this and I copy it and post it into SSMS, right, this is really what's running behind the scenes on this database. So you can see that it is one record that we're retrieving. And if I am to go over to the raw container, remember what we did was we renamed these files to be incremental. I certainly would not recommend that you share files with full and incremental, probably put them in their respective folder. But that's what I did just for this proof of concept. And here you can see that we now have a port table with a date stamp.parquet and a vessel table with a date stamp.parquet. And if I wanted to select top 100 rows here, we should see one record retrieved for us, and we do, and we see that 7. So that is going to do it for today's video, and that is going to wrap up our 3-part series using Delta Lake as our control table for full and incremental refreshes. Again, if you feel like you learned something, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you feel like something wasn't covered that you want to see, drop me a comment letting me know what it is. And thank you again for tuning in and following along. We're going to see you in the next one.